Welcome to the Meadow Star Crochet Along. We want to make sure we gather our supplies. We need 6 colors and a neutral. So in those 6 colors you want 3 different colors and 2 shades of each of those, all in the same weight of yarn and the appropriate size hook. Hopefully you have read through the introduction and watched those videos on how to find your correct size of hook. So once you've got your supplies ready, we'll get started. As we work our way through part 1, we're going to be learning a couple different techniques than we worked on in the introduction, just the entrelac process. So you can see a couple of them here. My last few rounds that I've worked on part 1, the connections and the joins were made similar to the way we did in the introduction. I started my first few rounds here with a slightly different method, and you can see how we have these raised lines sort of outlining each square and block. So we're going to learn how to do those. You can choose to do one or the other. That's optional for you. I've shown both. I'm not sure if I recommend both in the same blanket, although I am going to attempt to highlight certain parts with this sort of outlined version of the squares, and some of mine will be plain. That's how I'm going to work mine. Just so you're aware, there is an option, and I will be showing the first few rounds in the newer or the more advanced style of joining than we learned last week in the introduction. So to work part 1, we need to familiarize ourselves with our colors and how the numbering and the charts work for this pattern. So each of our colors are given a letter A through G, and you can see the designers, 2 choices of colors, and a blank space for you to write in your own color choices, so you always know which color is which. We are going to be combining some of these colors together, so those combined colors are given numbers 1 through 13. And then you can see on the chart it has those numbers in there, so you know which color is which. So we're going to be starting with the very center square, color 13, which is our G color, which should be the neutral. So in my case, that's white. There's also a blank chart for you to color in the squares with your own color combinations, if that is helpful to you. So we will work part 1 similar to how we worked the practice in the tutorial in the introduction. So starting with our neutral, the color G, we're going to chain 11. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then turning to the back bumps, we will pick up or insert our hook in the back bump of the chain, starting with that very first one, yarn over and pull up a loop. And we'll continue down the chain until we have 7 loops on our hook. It's 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 loops on our hook. We'll leave these other chains unworked for now. Then for the return pass, yarn over and pull through 2 down the entire row. For our first row, we're going to make a total of 5 rows. So we'll pick up a loop under each of the vertical bars, until there's 6 loops on our hook, and then in the next back bump of the next chain we will insert our hook and pick up our 7th loop. And you can see how the chain will start to go up the side to form our border stitch for this first block. Yarn over, pull through 2 until 1 loop left on the hook. We'll continue that for 3 more rows, and I'll meet you at that point. So once you have finished the 5 rows, you will have 1 chain left on our starting chain on that far side. We'll work the bind off row. Let's insert in the first bar, pull through the one on your hook as well. We don't want this to be very tight. as we'll need to work into these stitches later on. So binding off those 5, and then for the last one we insert into that last chain, pull up the loop and through the one on our hook. So we will pull through and pull this tight. We make the tie off knot. We don't fasten off as we're going to continue using G plus another color for the next round. We are going to be working in these top squares around the center square. So on the color chart, it's that lilac colored. So it's actually a combination of both our color A and our G, the neutral color. So because we were working with G for block 13, we will start our next block with the G, and I'm going to show you how we work 2 colors on each block. So you can get colors A and G ready. So for round 1, we are going to be using 2 colors. We start our chain for our square that we're making along this edge of our first square. We start with the same color we were working with, and we chain 5. Okay, working in the back bump of that very first chain, we will insert our hook to pull up a loop. We'll work across the chain, inserting under each back bump, pulling up a loop until we have 6 loops on our hook. And then to make the connection, we want to work behind this. So normally we would pick up the top 2 loops of that first chain, which is along our edge of the square. What this designer likes to do though is pick up a loop in behind that, so sort of where the return pass loops make sort of a back bump on the back, and we will insert our hook there, but we want to drop, we're going to switch colors, so we want our hook to be under the color that we just finished using. So I'll lay that across the top of my hook, and then I'm taking my second color, mine is light blue, and I will pull it through to pick up our 7th loop on the, so yarn over and pull through 2 to make the return pass. So 2 things different from the introduction tutorial in Entrelac. The first is the changing colors on the return pass, which is specific for this pattern. You'll want to do that. The making the connection in behind the stitch, as I just showed, is an option. You do not need to do that if you prefer working the entrelac as we showed you in the introduction, but it does make a nice effect and sort of makes each square pop up or stand out a little bit more. So I will be working showing you the connection in behind. So with our new color, which is color A, we will work the TSS stitches, so inserting under each bar, picking up a loop until we have 6 loops on our hook. Now it's time to make the connection, so working behind the second side stitch, picking up that loop behind, there it is, and we want our hook to be under color A. We will take our first color again to pull up a loop and then work the return pass. Okay, so you can see how we're blending the 2 colors together in this square and for this whole round. So row 3, picking up our loops using the color G from our first square, making the connection again. If you wish, you can just go under those top loops as was shown in the introduction, or you can go under, and we want to have that color, our hook under the color we just used, and switch to the second color, which is color A, and finish our return pass. Okay, we'll work 2 more rows the final row. And then we'll work the bind off using this color A. As we bind off this last stitch, we don't go in behind, we just enter onto under the loops. Again, wanting that color to be over top of our hook, so our hook is under the color. Pick up our first color to bind off that last stitch and to make that tie off knot. Pull nice and tight. I'm going to demonstrate for you how to change colors when working with 2 or more colors in a Tunisian project. So I'm doing a simple entrelac design and alternating colors for forward pass and return pass. So you can see how I've started my one row. We're going to make a forward pass, picking up loops with the working color, which is blue for my sample. We're going to drop that blue color yarn, pick up our other color, green. Insert into this. As we insert, before we pull the green loop up, we're going to also place the hook under the working yarn, the blue color that we dropped. Pull the loop through. I'm just going to snug the blue just a bit and then work your return pass. So my blue line, or my blue yarn, is set up working from the back, and my green yarn is always in front of that. So we'll do the forward pass with the green. I've picked up all my loops. Now before I do the connection, I'll drop the green color, pick up my blue color, insert into that next stitch, making sure the hook is under the green that I dropped, and pull the blue, the new color, through and finish the return pass. So I'll show you that one more time, each color, but the yarn is not tangled up. Forward pass with the blue, drop the blue, pick up the green. Insert into the next stitch, making sure the hook goes under the blue colored yarn, pull through the green, and finish the return pass. So enjoy working this tangle-free way of working 2 colors in Tunisian. Chain 5. And we'll repeat that again, pulling up a loop on the back side of each chain. And then in the next stitch, but remember we want to grab that loop that is behind. So here it is easier to see the behind loop as another horizontal bar across the back. We want to have our hook under that color, pick up the second color for our connection, and then work the return pass. Okay, so you can continue to finish this square and the remaining 2 squares after this one. So we have the 4 squares of round 1, changing color, and I'll meet you at the end of the round. So for our final square, we will continue with color A to make that last bind off stitch and the tie off knot, and then you can fasten off both colors. So it's recommended to weave in your ends at this point before you continue. When I'm working videos, I leave my ends a little bit longer before I sew them in, just in case I need to go back and fix something. So you will see my ends sticking out but it's a good idea to get into the habit of securing your ends as you work. So now it's time to work round 2. I always like to start on the top of the square and I work down the side like this. So we will be doing all color 2 for this round 2. So starting with color 2 in the top of one of our squares, we will join. If you are doing the regular entrelac technique, you will join with your hook under those top 2 loops and fasten on. Those of you who are working behind along with me, we will find that horizontal bar just behind those top loops and attach our yarn to that. We'll make our chain 5 and pick up the loops in the back bar of each chain. And then you'll insert back into the same loops as the join and make your return pass. And picking up TSS for row 2 of this first square of round 2. Join in back if you're using that option, or under those top loops if you're doing the standard entrelac technique. Okay, so you'll finish the next 3 rows for this stitch, and I'll meet you at that for this square, and I'll meet you at that point. So after you've worked all 5 rows, you will work the bind off across the top there, and then to bind off the final stitch, we go through the both loops there and make our tie off knot nice and tight. So you can see how we have the variation of color with our starting block, the 2-tone, and now a little bit darker with the solid color. So now we're ready to work our first in-between block for this pattern. So we will reinsert behind to pick up our loop in each of the loops across.
So sorry.
So we'll have picked up 6 loops across. And then on this first stitch of the next square, again, if you're working behind, you'll connect to the loop just behind those front loop V's and make your return pass. So we'll work our 5 rows for this in-between square. Making your connection either through those loops or in that back loop, depending on your preference. So you can finish the next few rows, and again, I'll meet you at the end of this square. So once you've worked that second square of this round, we will do the bind off row at the end. And again, the last stitch, we join to the top first stitch of the next square to bind off, and then we need to do that tight tie off knot as well. And then this is another top square we're working, so we'll start with that chain 5, pick up the loops in the back and then work it just as we did this other square. So you continue to work these top squares, the in-between square, all the way around, and I'll meet you just at the final join of the round. So when we are working our entrelac pieces into niching, we can have lots of different ends if we're changing colors frequently. So to help with weaving in the ends at the end, I'll show you the technique used to working over the ends that keep them locked and secured. So I'm starting my new block in here. I want to pick up loops going across. So as I pick up the loop, I will first go under the tail. So this is the tail. My hook goes under that tail to pull up the loop. In the next stitch, I insert in the stitch, but this time my hook goes over that tail to pull up a loop. Under the tail, over the tail. So this technique is called under, over. And then this last one here, I will work under. Now we can carry it up the side of this block as well while we do our connection. So into that first stitch, this time we go under each time when we make the connections. So pulling up our loops on our forward pass, up the side, we go under the tail to lock it into place. Under the tail to lock it into place. So when we are entering a stitch just to pull up a loop, as we did on these first ones here, we'll need to do that under over technique. Or if we wanted to carry our color across to this side, we would do the under over. Because we're making the connection and we have an extra yarn over, we can go under the hook each time, as each stitch there then is able to hold that tail. So when you're pulling up the loops, under over technique. When you're making connections, your hook always goes under the tail. So finishing up our last square, we just want to make that final bind off stitch in where we started our very first square. And we will do the tie off knot as well as fasten off. We'll find some slight curling on some of your squares as we continue to work. That works its way out. Round 2 complete. Round 3 is following color 3. So that's a combination of A and B. Start with color A, joining to a top square. So again, I'm working behind, to join. Chain 5, and pick up your loops on the back bump of the chain. Then we want to make our connection, so in that same stitch we will pick up our last loop, but we want to change to color B. Okay, so we drop color A, lay that over top of our hook, so our hook is under, and we pull our color B through and use B to work the return pass. And then you're just going to alternate colors as we did on round 1 through the rest of the rows for this first square, and I'll meet you at that point. So we do the bind off row using that color B, and then we make the last connection switching back to color A. and do the tie off knot. Okay, then we're going to be picking up our loops, and this time we need to pull, or we need to allow that B color yarn to come over to this far side of our square. So we'll do that under over technique. So as I insert under the loop, I will also go under that color B when I pull up my loop. This next time I'll insert my hook, but I want to go over color B strand to pick up the next loop. Insert hook, go under color B, insert hook, and have the hook go over color B. And one last time, insert the hook, going under color B, and then ready to make our connection to the side square, switching to color B, and that's why we did the under over, so color B was ready to be used for this return pass. And then we'll just continue our in-between square, alternating the colors each time at the return pass. I sort of like to hold the thread that we dropped for those first couple of return passes to make sure it's snug in there. One more row for this in-between square. Make the return pass and the bind off. Then we want to bind off in that last stitch, hook under color B, pull color A through for that last bind off, and make the tie off knot pulling tight. So that was our first in between square for round 3. So you can work in the same way and do the next in between square, and then ready to work another top square. So I'll meet you at this next top square. Remembering as we work this next in-between square to do that under-over technique to carry color B to the other side. So hook under color B for the first one as we pull up our first loop. Hook over color B for the second loop. Under color B while we pull up the third loop, over on the fourth loop, and hook under color B for the fifth loop. Make our connection, this time making sure we're under color A, pulling B through, and so on. That's the second in-between square. We should have done the bind off row with color B, switching to color A for that tie off knot, ready to start our chain 5 to start the next square. Okay, so your 4 squares should look something like this. We did a top square, 2 in-between square, just started another top square, ready to begin on the next side with the 2 in-between squares, top square, and so on. So you can work that all the way around. I'll meet you just before we join to our last square of this round. So on the final square, you want to make sure you bind off with color B, and I just stayed with color B to make that final tie off knot in that first stitch of this side square. And you'll also want to fasten off color A as well to complete round 3. So for round 4, we're going to start on a top square. This time we have 3 in between squares before the next top square. The entire round will be color 4, which is our B color. After round 4, the next 2 rounds, we will be switching colors partway through the round as well. So round 4, you can go ahead and work in the same way as we did previously, starting with your top stitch, or top square, doing the in-between squares, all in color 4, working all the way around. Now for the video, I'm going to show a few rounds worked going through both loops instead of working from behind. I don't recommend switching partway through your own pattern. This is just to demonstrate the various ways of working this pattern. So I'm going to be working, as I said, I'm going to be working through both loops, as I said. So we've chained 5 for our top square, picking up our loops in the back bump, coming down the chain, and then into that same place, and we will do the return pass. So this round should be fairly straightforward, keeping the same color all the way around, not working with 2 colors in the squares. So I'll let you finish this block 1, and then I'll show you one of the in-between squares, and then you can finish the round. So there's the top square in color B. I'm ready to work down. I've done the bind off and made my tie off knot, ready to start the first in-between square, picking up a loop across and making the connection to that first row and return pass. Okay, so remember I am showing working through both loops this time and not the working in behind. So you can go and continue that, finishing off the in-between squares and working all the way around for this round. We're ready now for round 5. We are going to be using color 8 for 3 squares, sorry, color 8 for 2 squares, color 2 for 2, and 8 again. Color 8, oops, so looking at our chart up here, color 8 is our color D. So for me, that will be my taupe colored. So starting at a top square, we will join to our square. Remember, if you're working in back, you join in back as well. Chain 5 And in those back bumps, we will pick up our loops. Six loops, and then back into that same stitch to pick up our last loop and do the return path, and work 5 more rows with this color, or 4 more rows to make the first square with color 8. So work the bind off row for this square. And we're going to stay with color 8, so we just do our final tie off knot for that. Then you can work the next square as well with color 8, and you can continue to do that under and over technique to secure the tail. As you pick up your first row loops, and as you work in the side there too, you can continue to work that tail in. Okay, so I'll let you continue to work on this next square, and I'll meet you for the square after that. So after we've done our bind off row and we go to connect to the next square, we want to make sure that we join color 2 this time. Snug that one in and do our tie off knot with color 2, as that is the color we need for this next square. So then you will fasten off color 8. And if you wish to work over the tail of color 8 using that under over technique as we make our next 2 squares, you can. So we'll just continue with color A now for 2 squares. Picking up our loops across. I split the yarn there, so let me try that once more. If you're joining in behind, you can still use this under over technique. I find it a bit more complicated when I'm working behind, but it is possible. And some colors you have to be careful. Some colors it won't work very well against, so I would likely stop doing the taupe at this point. Since I'm continuing with color A, I may work over that tail going up the side as well. Over. This one is under that tail. bind off row. And we're staying with color 2, so we can do that slip stitch with color 2. So you want to do one more square in between square using color 2, and I'll meet you at that point as we change back to color 8. So as we finish up the bind off row for our second square using color 2, we want to join with a slip stitch to that top stitch of that next square, but then we want to pull color 8 through again to close that bind off stitch and to make the tie off knot. So I'll just tighten up, oops, my color A2 so that loop there isn't stretched so far. Fasten off, and I do like to tie a knot. If I have another tail nearby, I tie the two together to secure that until I work the ends in. And then we'll do 2 more squares. Well, actually we'll do 3 more squares using this color 8. So an in-between square, a top square, and an in-between square. So you can go ahead and work those now. So now I'm ready to work my 2 squares using color A on this side, and then I'll work those 3 squares of color 8 and so on. So you can continue to repeat this first side all the way around, joining to our starting stitch and fastening off at the end of this round. So for the final round of part 1, we'll start up on a top square with color 8, and we'll do 3 squares color 8, 1 square color 2, 3 squares color 8, in the same way that we worked last round. So I've gone ahead and worked mine with my 3 squares of color 8, the 1 square of color 2, 3 more squares of color 8. So you can work that all the way around, fasten off at the end, and then if you haven't worked in your tails, please be sure to do that before you start part 2 next week. See you then.